Walburga Vogel watched a column of dust rise across the vast Texas plain, shielding her eyes from the relentless sun. After 2 weeks at Camp Hereford, she still couldn't accustom herself to the immensity of the American Southwest, how the sky seemed to stretch forever, how the horizon wavered in the heat like the uncertain future that awaited her and the other women. "They're coming," she said softly in German to Ilse beside her. 23 women stood in the yard of the prisoner-of-war camp, all wearing the same faded blue denim work clothes with PW stenciled across the back. Most had been nurses captured in North Africa, a few were auxiliaries from the Luftwaffe. Walburga had served as a field nurse at Tobruk until the British surrounded their position. From Libya to England to America, each transfer had taken her farther from home, from the small village outside Munich, where her parents still waited for letters that rarely arrived. "Americans," muttered Helga, the oldest of their group. "Always so much commotion." The approaching trucks kicked up more dust as they approached the gate. 2 weeks earlier, they'd been informed they were being transferred to a work detail. The commandant had explained, through an interpreter, that they would assist with agricultural duties on nearby ranches. Labor shortages had left the region desperate for workers to maintain food production. Walburga smoothed back a strand of honey-blonde hair that had escaped her simple braid. At 24, she was among the youngest of the prisoners, though the war had aged them all beyond their years. She'd seen too many men die under her hands, their blood soaking through bandages faster than she could replace them. She'd felt bombs shake hospital tents until supplies scattered across the floor. She'd learned to sleep through artillery barrages. But nothing had prepared her for Texas. The truck stopped at the gate, and several men in civilian clothing jumped down. One wore a uniform, the camp's liaison officer, Lieutenant Davis. But the others were dressed in a manner she'd only seen in American films: wide-brimmed hats, denim trousers, boots with spurs, and bandanas at their necks. "Cowboys," whispered Ilse with a nervous laugh. "Real American cowboys." Lieutenant Davis approached with a clipboard, conferring with their German-speaking guard, Sergeant Muller, an American of German descent who treated them with surprising kindness. "Ladies," Muller addressed them in German, "you will be divided into groups of 4 or 5. Each group will be assigned to a different ranch in the county. You'll work 6 days a week and return to camp on Sundays. The farmers and ranchers have been instructed on the Geneva Convention rules regarding your treatment." Walburga noticed one of the cowboys standing slightly apart from the others. Taller than the rest, with a lean frame and steady posture that reminded her of the career officers she'd known in Africa. Unlike the others who chatted among themselves, this one stood quietly, his eyes scanning their group with what seemed like curiosity rather than hostility or suspicion. When their eyes met briefly, Walburga looked away, feeling a strange flutter in her chest she hadn't experienced since before the war. Lieutenant Davis began calling names, and the women stepped forward in small groups, climbing onto the beds of different trucks. Walburga's name came forth, along with Ilse, Greta, and Margot. Vogel, Bauer, Keller, and Hoffman, Diamondback Ranch, called Davis. Sergeant Muller translated, and the 4 women shouldered their small bags of personal belongings. As they approached the designated truck, Walburga realized it belonged to the tall, quiet cowboy she'd noticed earlier. He touched the brim of his hat as they approached. "Ma'am," he said, then seemed to remember they likely didn't understand. He gestured to the truck bed instead. When all 4 were seated on the wooden benches bolted to the truck bed, the man climbed into the driver's seat. The engine rumbled to life, and they pulled away from Camp Hereford. The scenery gradually changed from flat plains to rolling hills dotted with mesquite trees and cattle. After an hour's drive in silence, they turned onto a dirt road that led to a sprawling ranch house. Behind it stood a weathered barn, corrals, and several outbuildings. As they pulled up to the house, an older woman emerged onto the porch. Her silver hair was pulled back in a bun, her face lined but kind. Beside her stood a younger woman who bore a striking resemblance, clearly her daughter. The cowboy helped them down from the truck with impersonal courtesy. Up close, Walburga could see his face more clearly, weathered from the sun, with lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled often, though he wasn't smiling now. Quinn Dawson, he introduced himself simply. This here's my mother, Etta, and my sister, Florence. Etta Dawson stepped forward. Welcome to Diamondback Ranch. I know this must be strange for you, but we'll do our best to make your time here, well, as comfortable as circumstances allow. Sergeant Muller, who had followed in a jeep, translated her words. Walburga and the others nodded politely, uncertain of what was expected. They'd been prisoners for over a year now, and had grown accustomed to various levels of contempt, pity, or professional detachment from their captors. This awkward attempt at hospitality was new and confusing. Etta continued, Florence will show you to the bunkhouse where you'll be staying. There's a washroom attached. You'll take meals with us in the main house. Work starts at sunrise tomorrow. As Florence led them to a small but clean building about 50 yards from the main house, Walburga caught Quinn Dawson watching them. When she glanced his way, he quickly turned and walked toward the barn. That night, the four women sat on their narrow beds, speaking in hushed tones. It's not what I expected, Greta admitted. They're treating us almost like guests. Don't be fooled, Margot warned. They need our labor, that's all. We're still prisoners.
Ilse nodded.
But at least we're not behind barbed wire for a while. Walburga remained silent, looking out the small window at the stars that seemed impossibly bright in the Texas sky. Tomorrow would reveal what kind of work awaited them, what kind of people these Dawsons truly were. She'd learned through bitter experience not to form judgments too quickly, not to hope for too much. Yet something about this place, perhaps the openness of the land, so different from the claustrophobic camps and battlefield hospitals, made her feel she could breathe fully for the first time in years. Dawn came early at Diamondback Ranch. Walburga woke to the sound of movement in the yard, and the women quickly dressed in their prison denims. They made their beds with military precision, a habit none of them had lost. Florence Dawson knocked on their door. Breakfast's ready in the main house. After that, my brother will show you your duties. The breakfast table held more food than Walburga had seen in one place since before the war. Eggs, bacon, biscuits, preserves, simple fare, but abundant. The Dawsons bowed their heads in a brief prayer before eating, which the German women observed respectfully. Etta Dawson did most of the talking, with Florence occasionally translating basic phrases she'd learned. Quinn remained largely silent, focusing on his plate, but Walburga caught him glancing at her several times. After breakfast, he led them outside. The ranch has been short-handed since most of our men enlisted, he explained, Muller translating his words. My father passed last year, and I couldn't go to war on account of this. He touched his left leg briefly, and Walburga noticed for the first time a slight stiffness in his gait. We've got crops to tend, animals to care for, and repairs needed all over the property. The army says you ladies worked as nurses, so I reckon you're not afraid of hard work. Walburga translated his words for the others, her English being the most proficient among them. We will work, she responded carefully in halting English. We are accustomed to duty. Quinn's eyebrows raised slightly, surprised at her comprehension. Good. Let's start with the vegetable garden. Florence will show you what needs doing there. For the next week, they fell into a rhythm. Mornings in the expansive garden, afternoons mending fences, feeding livestock, or cleaning out buildings. The work was hard but straightforward, and the Dawsons were fair taskmasters. They worked alongside the prisoners, eating the same food, taking breaks in the same shade. On their fifth day, Quinn approached Walburga as she collected eggs from the henhouse. You speak English pretty well, he said, leaning against the doorframe. I studied it in school, she replied carefully. Before the war. What did you do? Before, I mean. She hesitated, wary of personal questions. I was studying to be a doctor. Then the war came. He nodded, his expression unreadable. Seems we've all had our paths changed. You wish to fight? She asked, gesturing subtly toward his leg. A shadow crossed his face. Broke it bad when I was 16. Didn't heal right. My brother Jack's in the Pacific somewhere.
He paused.
Strange world, isn't it? Him fighting your people, and here you are collecting eggs on our ranch. Walburga placed the last egg in her basket. War makes strange situations for everyone. That it does. He straightened. Florence mentioned you know about plants, medicinal ones. Yes, from my studies and my grandmother. We've got a mare about to foal. Might be useful to have someone with medical knowledge nearby, even if it's the human kind. It wasn't quite an invitation, but Walburga felt it was an opening, a small acknowledgement of her as something more than a prisoner, more than an enemy. I would be glad to help if needed. He nodded once, touching the brim of his hat before walking away. That evening, as they sat outside their bunkhouse watching the sunset paint the sky in impossible colors, Ilse nudged Walburga. The tall one watches you when you're not looking, she said softly in German. Don't be ridiculous, Walburga replied, but felt her cheeks warm. Be careful, Margot warned. Remember who we are to them. Remember who they are to us. Walburga did remember. Every night she thought of home, of the war that continued without them, of the uncertain future that awaited Germany and its people. Yet here, in this strange land, working under this vast sky, something inside her was slowly unwinding, a tightness she'd carried since those first bombs fell. The next morning, Florence burst into their bunkhouse before dawn. The mare's having trouble, she said breathlessly. Quinn asked for you. She pointed at Walburga. In the barn, Quinn stood beside a chestnut mare lying on her side in a stall deeply bedded with straw. The animal's sides heaved with effort, her eyes wide with pain. Something's not right, Quinn said without preamble. The foal's position wrong, I think. Walburga nodded, rolling up her sleeves. She'd assisted with difficult births in her village before the war, mostly human ones, but the principles weren't entirely different. I need clean water, soap and towels, she said, surprised at her own authority. And something to tie back my hair. For the next hour, she worked steadily, directing Quinn with gestures and simple English when words failed. His hands were surprisingly gentle for their size, steady and patient as they worked together to reposition the foal. When the spindly-legged colt finally slid into the world, Quinn's face broke into the first genuine smile Walburga had seen from him. Without thinking, she smiled back, and for a moment, there was no war between them, no nations in conflict, just shared relief at new life safely delivered. Thank you, he said quietly as they washed up afterward at the pump outside the barn. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting everything in golden light. It is what I was trained to do, she replied. Help life, not. She trailed off, unsure how to express the bitter irony that her nation had ultimately used her skills in service of a war that brought only death. Not destruction, he finished for her. He dried his hands on a rough towel, then offered it to her. War's a strange business. Makes enemies of folks who might have been friends in another time. Their fingers brushed as she took the towel, and neither pulled away immediately. For a heartbeat, Walburga felt the world narrow to just this moment. The cool morning air, the distant lowing of cattle, and Quinn Dawson's eyes, gray-blue, like the sky before a storm. Then he stepped back, the moment passing like a cloud shadow over the plains. You should get some rest before regular chores, he said, his voice returning to its usual reserve. I'll tell Mother you helped save our most valuable mare. She'll be grateful. As May turned to June, the Texas heat intensified. Work began earlier to avoid the scorching midday sun. Gradually, language barriers softened. Greta and Margot learned enough English to communicate basic needs, while Florence and Etta picked up German phrases. Even Mrs. Peterson, the neighboring rancher's wife who initially refused to acknowledge the enemy women, eventually brought over a peach cobbler as a peace offering. Only Quinn remained somewhat distant, though Walburga often found herself working alongside him. He wasn't unfriendly, just careful, measured in his words and actions. Yet she noticed how he assigned her tasks that matched her abilities, how he made sure she had water during the hottest parts of the day, how his eyes sometimes followed her when he thought she wasn't aware. One evening, as Walburga sat on the porch steps of the bunkhouse writing in her journal, Quinn approached with a book in hand. Found this in my father's library, he said, offering her a German-English medical dictionary. Thought it might interest you. She accepted it with surprise. Thank you. This is very kind. He shrugged. Not much use to anyone else around here. Instead of leaving, he hesitated, then sat on the opposite end of the step. For several minutes, they existed in surprisingly comfortable silence as the first stars appeared overhead. What will you do? He asked finally. After the war? The question caught her off guard. They never discussed the future. If I can, I will finish my medical studies, she said after a moment. But I don't know what will be left of our universities. Or our cities. She traced the cover of the dictionary with her fingertips. And you? When your brother returns? Return to normal, I suppose. Whatever that means now. He gazed out at the darkening land. Jack always wanted to expand the ranch. If he comes home, maybe we will. The unspoken if hung between them. I never wanted to be a soldier, Walburga said suddenly. I wanted to heal, not hurt. But when everyone tells you it's your duty. She shook her head. You begin to doubt your own heart. Quinn turned to her, his face half in shadow. I understand that better than you might think. Before she could respond, Florence called from the main house that a letter had arrived for Walburga from the Red Cross. Quinn stood, offering his hand to help her up. She took it briefly, then released it as if burned by the contact. The letter contained news that her younger brother had been killed on the Eastern Front. That night, Walburga wept silently into her pillow, trying not to wake the others. When she finally stepped outside for air, she found a handkerchief and a small jar of honey left on the bunkhouse step. Things Etta Dawson had mentioned helped her through grief when her husband died. Walburga knew they must have come from Quinn. July brought a different rhythm to Diamondback Ranch. The prisoners were now familiar enough with their duties that the Dawsons could leave them unsupervised for periods. Every Sunday, they returned to Camp Hereford as required, spending the day with other German prisoners before returning to the ranch. During one such Sunday, as they sat in the camp's recreation area, Ilse mentioned rumors circulating among the prisoners. They say Germany is losing badly now, she whispered. The Americans have landed in France. Russia pushes from the east. Our cities burn nightly. Walburga closed her eyes briefly. And what happens to us when Germany falls? When we are not just prisoners but the defeated? None of them had an answer. When they returned to the ranch that evening, Quinn was waiting alone by the truck. Everything all right at the camp? He asked as they climbed down. Walburga nodded, not trusting herself to speak. The others headed toward the bunkhouse, but she lingered. We heard news, she said finally, about the war. Not good news for my country. Quinn looked at her for a long moment. War news is rarely good for anyone, he said quietly. Come on. Mother saved supper for you all. Later that week, as Walburga helped Florence preserve vegetables from the garden, the younger woman broached a subject they normally avoided. Quinn was engaged before the war, she said, carefully filling a jar with pickled beans. To a girl from town, Caroline Miller. Walburga kept her expression neutral, though her hands stilled momentarily. Oh. She broke it off after Pearl Harbor. Said she couldn't marry a man who wasn't fighting for his country. Florence sealed the jar with more force than necessary. As if Quinn hadn't tried 3 times to enlist, as if his leg was something he chose. I'm sorry, Walburga said, meaning it. People can be cruel when afraid. Florence studied her. He's different since you all came.
Talks more.
Even smiles sometimes. Walburga felt her cheeks warm. Miss Florence, I'm not saying anything improper, Florence interrupted. Just that, sometimes people find understanding in unexpected places. That evening, a violent thunderstorm swept across the ranch. Rain pounded the bunkhouse roof, and lightning split the sky in jagged bursts. Just before midnight, a particularly loud thunderclap woke the women. The roof is leaking, Greta exclaimed, pointing to water streaming down one wall. They grabbed buckets and towels, but the leak worsened. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. Quinn stood there in a rain-slicked coat. Thought this might happen, he said, raising his voice over the storm. This building's got a weak spot in the southwest corner. You'd better come to the main house until it passes. They gathered their nightclothes and followed him through the downpour to the farmhouse, where Etta and Florence were already preparing the sitting room with blankets and pillows. "You poor dears," Etta clucked. "Quinn, get them some towels." As the others settled, Quinn touched Walburga's elbow lightly. "There's a fire in the study if you want to dry off properly. The others can use the kitchen hearth." The study was small but comfortable, with bookshelves lining the walls and a fire crackling in a stone fireplace. Walburga stood before it gratefully, her wet hair dripping onto her shoulders. Quinn handed her a towel, then turned to leave. "Thank you," she said, stopping him, "for bringing us in from the storm. Couldn't leave you in a leaking building." "No, but some might have." He paused, his hand on the doorknob. "I've been thinking about what you said, about duty making you doubt your own heart." The firelight cast his face in warm light and deep shadow. "Sometimes I wonder if duty is just what other people want us to call their expectations." Walburga dried her hair with the towel, considering his words. "Perhaps. But we still must live in the world with others. Their expectations shape our lives whether we wish it or not." "And what about your expectations for yourself? What does Walburga Vogel want, beyond what Germany or the war demands?" The question startled her. It had been so long since anyone had asked what she wanted, had seen her as an individual rather than a nurse or a German or a prisoner. "I want," she hesitated. "I want to remember what peace feels like. To use my hands for healing instead of just enduring. To see my parents again if they still live. To sleep without dreaming of bandages that are never enough to stop the bleeding." She had meant to say so much, but the words tumbled out like the rain outside, unstoppable once begun. Quinn stepped closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of darker blue in his gray eyes. "I think you will have those things again. Not exactly as before, but something like peace at least." "And you," she asked softly, "what does Quinn Dawson want?" His gaze held hers steadily. "Right now? Something I shouldn't." The air between them seemed to thicken, charged like the lightning-filled sky outside. Walburga knew she should step back, look away, remind them both of the impossibility represented by the PW stenciled on her clothing. Instead, she found herself saying, "War makes strange situations for everyone." Quinn's hand rose slowly, hesitated, then gently tucked a strand of damp hair behind her ear. "Stranger than this?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the storm. Before she could answer, Florence's voice called from the hallway. "Quinn, Mother needs help securing the cellar doors." He stepped back immediately, the moment broken. "Get dry," he said, his voice returning to its usual tone. "Try to rest if you can." After he left, Walburga stayed by the fire, her heart racing with emotions she'd kept carefully buried since her capture. Attraction was dangerous enough in peacetime. Between enemies in wartime, it was impossible. Yet here it was, undeniable as the storm outside. August brought rumors that the war in Europe might end before winter. News of German defeats reached them even at the isolated ranch, and the women spoke in whispers about what would happen to them, to their families, to their devastated homeland. The dynamics at Diamondback Ranch had subtly shifted. The lines between captors and prisoners blurred as shared labor and daily life forged unexpected bonds. Etta taught the German women to make proper Texas biscuits. Greta showed Florence how to knit continental style. Margot, who had been a music teacher before the war, gave Etta piano lessons on the old upright in the parlor. And Walburga found herself increasingly in Quinn's company, checking fences in the north pasture, doctoring a sick calf, picking late summer apples from the small orchard. They worked mostly in companionable silence, but occasionally shared stories of their lives before the war. She told him about the small Bavarian village where she'd grown up, about her grandmother's herb garden, about her first day of medical school. He spoke of cattle drives with his father, of teaching his brother to fish in the creek that ran through their property, of the books he read during the lonely winters. They never mentioned the moment by the fire during the thunderstorm, but it lingered between them like an unfinished sentence. One evening in late August, Quinn found Walburga sitting alone on the corral fence, watching the sunset. "The others inside?" he asked, leaning against the fence beside her. She nodded. "Ilsa isn't feeling well. The others are keeping her company." Nothing serious, I hope. Just a headache from the heat, I think. They fell silent, watching as the sun transformed the sky into bands of orange, pink, and deepening blue. I've been meaning to ask you something, Quinn said finally. The other prisoners at the camp, have any of you been on horseback before? Walburga smiled slightly. Are you asking if the stereotype of Germans and horses is true? Is it? I rode as a child, yes. My uncle had horses. The others, I'm not sure. Why do you ask? Quinn shifted, suddenly seeming almost boyish in his enthusiasm. Been thinking it might be useful to teach you all to ride. There's a section of fence in the south pasture that needs checking regularly, and it would save time if you could ride out there instead of walking. Is that the only reason? She asked, surprised by her own boldness. He glanced at her, a smile tugging at his lips. Maybe I also thought you might enjoy it. Freedom of a sort, even if it's just around the ranch. The offer touched her more deeply than she expected. After years of confinement, first by duty, then by capture, the idea of riding across open land carried a symbolic weight. I would like that very much, she said softly. The next morning, Quinn brought 5 horses to the corral, one for each of the women and himself. Ilse and Margot were hesitant, having never ridden before, but Greta shared Walburga's experience. We'll start slow, Quinn assured them, helping Ilse onto a gentle mare. Just around the corral today. Florence joined them, and for the next hour, they walked the horses in circles, learning or remembering how to give basic commands. Walburga found her body recalling the rhythms easily, muscle memory returning from childhood summers at her uncle's farm. Quinn noticed. You've definitely ridden before, he said, watching her guide her horse with subtle shifts of weight and gentle pressure from her legs. It has been many years, she admitted. But yes, I loved riding as a girl. After Ilse and Margot had enough practice to feel comfortable at a walk, Quinn suggested that he and Walburga ride out to check the south pasture, while Florence continued lessons with the others. They rode side by side across the golden grassland, the horses settling into an easy walk. For nearly an hour, they spoke little, simply existing in the shared quiet of the open range. Occasionally Quinn would point out features of the landscape, a hawk's nest in a distant tree, tracks of deer or coyote, a cluster of late-blooming wildflowers. At the fence line, they dismounted to check the wire and posts. The physical work was familiar now, their movements coordinated without need for much discussion. As they prepared to head back, Quinn paused, looking out across the land that stretched toward the horizon. Sometimes I think about what you said, he remarked, about war making strange situations. 2 years ago, if someone told me I'd be riding fence with a German prisoner of war, a female one at that, I'd have thought they were touched in the head. Walburga adjusted her horse's bridle. And I would never have imagined Texas or cowboys or... She hesitated. Or feeling more at peace as a prisoner than I did as a free woman in service to my country. Quinn studied her face. Are you at peace here, Walburga? The sound of her name in his voice sent an unexpected warmth through her. He rarely addressed her directly by name. As much as anyone can be, knowing what continues elsewhere, she answered honestly. Your family has been kind beyond what duty requires. Not just duty, he said quietly. Before she could respond, he swung back into his saddle. Want to try a gallop on the way back? Ground's flat and clear here. The invitation to run, to feel true freedom even briefly, was irresistible. Walburga mounted her horse, gathering the reins with practiced hands. Race you to the ridge, she challenged with a smile that felt foreign on her face, playful, almost youthful. They took off across the pasture, hooves pounding the earth, wind rushing past. Walburga's hair came loose from its braid, streaming behind her like a banner. For those few exhilarating minutes, she was neither German nor prisoner, nurse nor enemy, just a woman on a horse under an endless sky, laughing with surprising joy as Quinn's horse pulled alongside hers. When they reached the ridge, breathless and flushed with exertion, Quinn was looking at her differently, with an openness he usually kept carefully guarded. You should laugh more often, he said simply. The ride back to the ranch was slower, both of them aware that something had shifted between them, a boundary crossed that had nothing to do with national borders or war. That night, Walburga wrote in her journal for the first time in weeks, "I am beginning to fear peace more than war. In war, the lines are clear, enemy and ally, duty and survival. But peace will bring questions I don't know how to answer. Where will home be in a defeated Germany? What will remain of the life I knew? And how will I forget this strange interlude in Texas, these people who have become something other than captors, this man who looks at me and sees beyond the uniform and the nationality to the woman beneath? God forgive me, but I find myself wishing these days could stretch longer, even knowing what that would mean for the war, for my country, for those still fighting and dying. Is it betrayal to find moments of happiness amid so much suffering? Or is it the only way to remain human?" September brought news that Allied forces were advancing rapidly through France and Belgium. Rumors spread through Camp Hereford that arrangements were already being made for the eventual repatriation of prisoners once Germany surrendered. During their Sunday visits to the camp, the mood among the prisoners had transformed. Early defiance had given way to resignation, then to anxiety about the homeland they would eventually return to. Letters from family, when they arrived, spoke of destroyed cities, food shortages, and uncertainty about the future. "My sister writes that our neighborhood in Hamburg is gone," Ilse told the others as they sat in their bunkhouse one evening. "Just gone. She doesn't recognize the streets anymore." Greta nodded sadly. "My parents' farm was requisitioned for the war effort years ago. I don't know if there will be anything to return to." "At least you'll have somewhere to go," Margot said. "My family was in Dresden." They all fell silent at that. News of Dresden's destruction had reached them even in Texas. Walburga stared out the window toward the main house, where lamplight glowed in the downstairs windows. "We are fortunate in a way," she said softly, "to be here, away from it all." "Fortunate to be prisoners?" Margot asked sharply. "Yes," Walburga replied simply. "Better prisoners here than free in a Germany that burns." Later that night, unable to sleep, Walburga slipped outside to sit on the bunkhouse steps. The autumn air had a slight chill, and she wrapped her arms around herself, gazing up at stars that seemed impossibly numerous and bright. Footsteps approached from the direction of the barn. Quinn appeared, carrying what looked like a bundle of fabric. "Thought you might be cold," he said, offering her a worn but clean flannel jacket. "Nights are getting cooler." She accepted it with a small smile. "Thank you. I couldn't sleep." "May I?" He gestured to the step beside her. She nodded, and he sat, leaving a respectful distance between them. "News from the camp?" he asked. "Nothing official. Just letters, stories." She pulled the jacket tighter around her shoulders. "Germany is being destroyed piece by piece. The country I returned to will not be the one I left." Quinn was quiet for a moment. "After the Civil War here, the South was devastated. My great-grandfather lost everything except this land. Took generations to rebuild." "Is that supposed to be comforting?" she asked, but without bitterness. "Just truth. It will be hard, the rebuilding. But Germans are stubborn folk. Resourceful, too. Like Texans," she suggested with a hint of a smile. "Maybe that's why we get along better than expected. Stubborn recognizes stubborn." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds, distant coyotes, the occasional lowing of cattle, the creak of the windmill that pumped water to the house. "Quinn," she said finally, using his first name for the rare time, "may I ask you something personal?" He nodded. "If your leg had been sound, would you have gone to fight? Against my country?" He considered the question carefully. "Yes," he answered honestly. "I would have gone where they sent me. But I'd like to think I'd have remembered that the enemy were people first. Like I've learned here." "With us, you mean?" "With you," he corrected quietly, and they both knew he meant her specifically. Walburga looked down at her hands, callous now from ranch work. "When I was captured, I expected chains, humiliation, perhaps worse. We had heard stories." She glanced toward the dark outline of the barn, the corrals. "Instead, I found horses. And people who saw me as human despite the uniform." Isn't that what you did as a nurse? See the human beyond the uniform. I tried. But war makes it difficult to remember our common humanity. Quinn shifted slightly closer. Walburga, when this is over, when you go back. She turned to him, her heart suddenly racing. Yes. He seemed to reconsider whatever he had been about to say. Remember that not all Americans were your enemies. That's all. But his eyes said more, much more, and Walburga felt a sharp ache in her chest for all the words they couldn't speak, the feelings they couldn't acknowledge. I will remember, she promised softly. October brought harvest time and preparations for winter. The prisoners had been at Diamondback Ranch for nearly 5 months now, becoming so integrated into its rhythms that it was sometimes easy to forget the circumstances that had brought them there. One crisp morning, Lieutenant Davis arrived unexpectedly at the ranch. He spoke with Quinn privately before asking to address the prisoners. Ladies, he said formally as they gathered in the yard, I've been instructed to inform you that arrangements are being made for the eventual repatriation of German prisoners of war following the anticipated conclusion of hostilities in Europe. While no specific timeline has been established, you should be prepared for transfer back to the main camp facility with limited notice. The news, though expected, hit Walburga with surprising force. The end of their time at Diamondback Ranch, this strange interlude of almost normalcy, was approaching. That afternoon, as she worked alongside Quinn repairing a section of the barn roof, she found herself studying his profile surreptitiously, trying to memorize the lines of his face, the way sunlight caught in his hair. You're quiet today, he observed, hammering a nail into place. Just thinking about Lieutenant Davis's news. Quinn's hammer paused mid-stroke. That didn't come as a surprise, did it? We all knew this arrangement was temporary. No, not a surprise. Just. She searched for the right words. When something ends that you've grown accustomed to, even if you always knew it would end, it still feels sudden when the time comes. He nodded slowly. I understand that feeling. They worked in silence for a while longer, the rhythm of their hammers creating a counterpoint to the thoughts neither expressed. Finally, Quinn set down his tools. I've been meaning to show you something, if you're interested. Curious, Walburga followed him down from the roof and across the ranch yard to a small building she'd rarely entered, Quinn's private workshop. Inside, tools hung in neat rows along one wall. A workbench occupied the center of the room, and various projects in different stages of completion filled the space. Quinn moved to a cabinet in the corner and carefully removed something wrapped in soft cloth. He set it on the workbench and unwrapped it to reveal a carved wooden box with intricate decorations along its edges. It's beautiful, Walburga said, running her fingers lightly over the detailed carvings of Texas wildflowers and horses. Been working on it during evenings, Quinn explained, a hint of self-consciousness in his voice. My grandfather taught me woodworking when I was young. Helps me think. You're very skilled. He opened the lid, revealing a velvet-lined interior with small compartments. It's a medicine box, he said. For a doctor. Or a doctor-to-be. Walburga looked up at him in surprise. Quinn, I know you can't take much with you when you go, he continued quickly. And I know it's not practical. But I thought, maybe someday when you finish your medical studies, you might have use for it. The gift, its thoughtfulness, the hours of work it represented, the faith it expressed in her future, moved her deeply. She touched the smooth interior, imagining it holding instruments or medicines in some distant, peaceful time. Thank you, she said softly. I've never received anything so meaningful. Quinn closed the lid gently. It's not quite finished. The hinges need work, and I want to add your initials here. He pointed to a smooth space on the lid. You'll have time to finish it, she said, though neither knew for certain how much time remained. As they left the workshop, their hands brushed briefly. Without thinking, Walburga caught his fingers with hers, squeezing gently before letting go, the first deliberate touch she had initiated between them. That evening, Florence found Walburga alone in the garden, gathering the last of the season's herbs. Quinn showed you the box, she said, not a question. Walburga nodded. It's extraordinary craftsmanship. He started it the week after you helped deliver that full, Florence said, kneeling to help with the herbs. I've never seen him work so carefully on anything. Walburga focused intently on the plants before her, uncertain how to respond. My brother is a good man, Florence continued. Too good sometimes. He feels things deeply, but keeps them locked inside. She looked directly at Walburga. I think you understand that tendency. Miss Florence. I'm not blind, Walburga. None of us are. But we're also not fools. We know the realities. She sighed, her expression softening. I just want you to know that whatever happens when this war ends, you've brought something good to this ranch. To all of us. Later, Walburga recorded Florence's words in her journal, adding, How strange that in captivity I have found a kind of family, while the family of my homeland tears itself apart. If I could keep one thing from this time, it would not be the freedom of horseback rides or the comfort of enough food, or even the respite from bombers overhead. It would be the way Quinn Dawson looks at me across the dinner table when he thinks no one notices, like I am simply a woman he admires, not an enemy, not a nurse, not a representative of a regime that his brother fights against somewhere in the Pacific. But wishes are luxuries of peacetime, and we remain at war despite the changing tide. Whatever grows between us must remain unspoken, unnamed, like a seed that cannot be planted in the current season. November brought news that shocked the camp. President Roosevelt had been re-elected to a fourth term. More significantly for the prisoners, intelligence reports suggested Germany might not last through winter. During their Sunday visit to Camp Hereford, the atmosphere was charged with anxiety and anticipation. Some prisoners spoke excitedly of returning home. Others voiced fear about what they would find upon return. I've requested permission for you ladies to remain at the ranch until final repatriation orders come through, Lieutenant Davis told them as they prepared to return that evening. Given your excellent conduct record and the ongoing labor needs, it's likely to be approved. The news brought mixed feelings. More time at Diamondback meant delaying the inevitable return to a devastated Germany, but it also meant prolonging a situation that grew more complicated with each passing day. As November progressed, the temperature dropped sharply. The first frost silvered the grass, and mornings began with breaking ice in water troughs. Work shifted indoors, mending tack, preserving the last of the harvest, repairing tools and equipment for spring. One evening, as Walburga helped Etta prepare dinner, the older woman broached a subject they had all carefully avoided. Thanksgiving is next week, she said, kneading bread dough with practiced hands. It's an American tradition, a day of gratitude for blessings received. Walburga nodded. I've read about it. We usually have a special meal. Family, neighbors. Etta paused. You girls are welcome to join us. You've become part of this ranch, whatever the circumstances that brought you here. The invitation touched Walburga deeply. Thank you, Mrs. Dawson. I think we would all like that very much. Etta smiled, then hesitated before adding, My son cares for you, you know. More than is wise, perhaps. Walburga's hands stilled on the vegetables she was chopping. Mrs. Dawson. No need to say anything, dear. I'm not blind, and I'm not upset. The heart doesn't recognize borders or uniforms. She shaped the dough into a loaf with practiced movements. Quinn was always one to swim against the current, even as a boy. It's impossible, Walburga said softly. You know that. Many things seem impossible during wartime that find a way afterward. Etta placed the bread in a pan to rise. History is full of unlikely love stories born in conflict. Love, Walburga echoed, the word startling in its directness. Etta looked at her steadily. What else would you call it? Walburga had no answer. They hadn't spoken of love, hadn't even acknowledged the connection that had grown between them. To name it seemed dangerous, like striking a match near spilled fuel. Thanksgiving arrived with clear skies and biting cold. The Dawsons invited the Petersons from the neighboring ranch and the Millers from town, including, to Walburga's surprise, Caroline, Quinn's former fiancée. The German women helped prepare an abundance of food: turkey, mashed potatoes, sweet potato casserole, green beans, cranberry sauce, and 3 kinds of pie. They wore their best clothes, which weren't much. Clean prison denims and blouses Florence had altered to fit them better. Initial awkwardness gave way to surprising warmth as the meal progressed. Mr. Peterson, who had fought in the previous war, engaged Greta in a discussion about classical music they both loved. Mrs. Miller complimented Margot on her English pronunciation. Caroline, after an initial coolness, seemed to thaw when she observed how Quinn interacted with Walburga, always proper, always careful, but with an attentiveness that spoke volumes. After dinner, as the guests gathered in the parlor, Caroline found Walburga alone in the kitchen, putting away leftovers. "So you're the German nurse," she said without preamble. Walburga straightened.
Yes.
"And you are Quinn's friend." Caroline's laugh held little humor. "Former fiancé, you mean? I'm sure Florence told you the whole sad story." "Some of it," Walburga acknowledged cautiously. "I made a mistake," Caroline said, surprising Walburga with her frankness. "I believed what everyone was saying, that men who didn't fight weren't real men. I was young and foolish." Walburga remained silent, uncertain where this confession was leading. "He's different now," Caroline continued. "Quinn, I mean. There's a piece to him that wasn't there before." She studied Walburga carefully. "I think you might have something to do with that." "We're just prisoners working on his ranch," Walburga said, the words sounding hollow even to her own ears. Caroline shook her head. "No, it's more than that. The way he looks at you."
She sighed.
"Well, he never looked at me that way." Before Walburga could respond, Quinn himself appeared in the doorway. "Everything all right in here?" Caroline smiled brightly.
Just girl talk.
"I was just telling Miss Vogel how delicious the meal was." After she departed, Quinn lingered in the kitchen. "Did she say something to upset you?" "No," Walburga assured him. "She was kind, actually." Quinn nodded, though he seemed unconvinced. "When you're finished in here, would you join me outside for a moment? There's something I'd like to show you." Curious, Walburga followed him out the back door and across the yard toward the corral. The night was clear and cold, stars scattered across the black sky like diamond dust. In the corral stood a horse she hadn't seen before, a beautiful bay mare with a white blaze down her face. "This is Morgenrot," Quinn said. "Morning red. She's the foal we delivered last spring." Walburga approached the fence, amazed at how the gangly newborn had grown into such a magnificent animal. "She's beautiful." "She's yours," Quinn said quietly. "If you want her." Walburga turned to him in shock.
"Mean?"
"But I can't." "Not to take with you," he clarified. "But while you're here, and afterward. Well, she'll be here if you ever find your way back to Texas." The implications of his words, the hope embedded in them, the future they hinted at beyond war and separation, left her momentarily speechless. "Quinn," she finally managed, "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything. Just write her tomorrow if you'd like." As they stood by the corral, the distance between them seemed both vast and insignificant, oceans and nations, and a war still separating them, yet close enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence in the cold night air. "Thank you," she said finally. "For everything. For treating us as people, not enemies. For showing me another way to see the world beyond divisions of nationality and uniform." Quinn turned to her, his expression solemn in the moonlight. "Walburga, when this war ends," she placed her fingers gently against his lips, stopping his words. "Don't make promises neither of us can keep. The future has too many uncertainties." He caught her hand as she withdrew it, holding it carefully between both of his. For a long moment, they stood frozen in that almost embrace, neither willing to step back, neither daring to move closer. Finally, Quinn pressed something into her palm, a small carved wooden horse, a perfect miniature replica of Morgenrot. "Something to remember Texas by," he said softly, "when you go home." Walburga closed her fingers around the carving, knowing she would keep it always, this token of a connection that war had both created and made impossible. December brought snow to the Texas Panhandle, transforming the ranch into a landscape of white plains and crystalline beauty. It also brought news that the German offensive in the Ardennes had failed, the last major counterattack Germany would mount. The end was coming, everyone knew it now. It was only a matter of when, not if. 2 days before Christmas, Lieutenant Davis arrived with official orders. All prisoners would return to the main camp after the new year, in preparation for eventual repatriation once hostilities ceased. The news cast a shadow over the Christmas preparations at Diamondback Ranch. Though expected, the concrete timeline made their remaining days together painfully finite. On Christmas Eve, the Dawsons invited the German women to join them for their family traditions. They attended a candlelight service at the small church in town, where the minister spoke of peace on earth with a poignancy that brought tears to many eyes. Afterward, they gathered in the ranch house parlor to exchange simple gifts and sing carols, American and German both. Etta had knitted scarves for each of the prisoners. Florence gave them each a small book of English poetry. The German women had pooled their meager resources to create gifts in return: a hand-embroidered tablecloth for Etta, a carved wooden picture frame for Florence, and for Quinn, a detailed map of the ranch Walburga had drawn, marking all the places that had become significant during their stay. Later, when the others had gone to bed, Walburga found Quinn alone in the study, staring into the dying fire. "May I join you?" she asked from the doorway. He looked up, his face softening at the sight of her. "Please." She sat in the chair opposite his, the wooden horse he had carved held in her palm. "I've been thinking about what happens next. After you leave," he asked quietly. She nodded. "Germany will be difficult. Years of rebuilding ahead. If my medical school still stands, I'll try to complete my studies. If not," she shrugged, "I'll find another way to help. There will be no shortage of need for healing." Quinn watched her face in the firelight. "You'll be a fine doctor. Those hands were made for healing." She looked down at her hands, remembering all they had done during the war years: bandaged wounds, delivered babies, planted gardens, mended fences, and once, very briefly, touched Quinn Dawson's face when no one was looking. "I've been thinking too," Quinn said after a moment, "about after the war. This ranch has done well, despite everything. There might be possibilities." "Possibilities," she echoed. "For expansion. Maybe beyond cattle. Medical research, perhaps. There are universities in Texas that might interest a German-trained doctor someday." The implication hung in the air between them, a future neither dared name directly, but both could imagine in the quiet of the firelit room. "Quinn," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "we can't know what the world will look like when this war ends. Germany may not allow its citizens to emigrate for years. America may not welcome Germans, especially those who served the Reich, however unwillingly." "I know," he acknowledged. "I'm not asking for promises. Just leaving a door open." Walburga felt tears threatening and blinked them back. "A door open," she repeated softly. In the quiet that followed, something shifted between them, a silent acknowledgement of feelings that had grown despite every reason they shouldn't have, despite the knowledge that separation was inevitable. "I should go," she said finally, rising from her chair. "It's late."
Quinn stood as well.
Walburga. Whatever he might have said was interrupted by Florence calling from upstairs about a leaking pipe in the bathroom. The moment broken, they exchanged a look of shared regret for words unspoken. "Merry Christmas, Quinn," Walburga said simply. "Merry Christmas, Walburga." As she walked back to the bunkhouse through the snow, she held the carved horse tightly in her hand, a tangible reminder of everything Diamondback Ranch had come to represent: unexpected kindness, moments of freedom amid captivity, and a connection that defied the logic of wartime. The final days passed too quickly. On their last Sunday at Camp Hereford, Lieutenant Davis provided new information. They would be transferred to a processing center in New York after the German surrender, then repatriated on transport ships. The timeline remained uncertain, but they should prepare for departure within weeks of the war's end. Their last day at Diamondback Ranch dawned clear and cold. They spent it completing chores, gathering their few possessions, saying goodbye to the animals they had tended. Walburga spent an hour with Morgenrot, brushing her coat until it gleamed, whispering promises she wasn't sure she could keep about returning someday. Dinner that night was subdued, everyone aware of the army truck that would arrive in the morning to take them back to the main camp. Etta had prepared their favorite dishes, and Florence had baked a cake, but the festive touches only highlighted the farewell that loomed. After the meal, as they sat in the parlor listening to the radio, Etta surprised them with an announcement. "Quinn," she said, "why don't you take the women for one last ride? The moon is full, and the snow has stopped. It would be a shame for them to leave without seeing Diamondback under moonlight." The suggestion was unexpected but welcome. Soon they were all bundled in warm coats, mounted on horses, following Quinn along a trail that led to a ridge overlooking the ranch. The full moon illuminated the landscape, transforming the snow-covered plains into a silver ocean stretching to the horizon. They sat in silence for several minutes, absorbing the beauty of the Texas night. Gradually, the others turned their horses back toward the ranch, leaving Quinn and Walburga alone on the ridge. "I'll miss this view," she said softly. "I'll miss this land." Quinn's horse shifted closer to hers. "The land will remember you," he said. "And so will I." Walburga turned to him, her heart full of words she couldn't speak, feelings she couldn't express within the constraints of their reality. "In another life," she began. "In another time," he continued. "Perhaps we would have met differently," she finished. Quinn reached across the space between their horses, taking her gloved hand in his. "Walburga Vogel," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion she could see in his eyes. "I will never forget the German nurse who helped deliver a foal in my barn, who rode horses instead of wearing chains, who showed me that humanity survives even in the worst of times." She tightened her fingers around his. "And I will never forget Quinn Dawson, who saw me as a person when the world saw only an enemy, who gave me back something I thought the war had taken forever: hope." In that moment, under the vast Texas sky, they allowed themselves what they had denied for months: a single kiss, gentle and brief, filled with all the longing and impossible hope that had grown between them. When they rode back to the ranch, something had changed, not a promise made, but a truth acknowledged. Whatever the future held, whatever oceans or borders separated them, they had found something rare and precious amid the chaos of war, a connection that transcended national allegiance, a reminder that even in the darkest times, the human heart remains capable of unexpected grace. May 8, 1945, Camp Hereford, Texas. The news came over the loudspeakers in the early morning. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. In the women's barracks, reactions were mixed: relief, grief, anxiety about the future. Walburga sat on her bunk, reading the letter that had arrived the previous day from Diamondback Ranch. It contained notes from Etta and Florence, updates about the animals, and news that Jack Dawson would be returning from the Pacific soon, having been wounded but expected to recover. At the bottom, in Quinn's neat handwriting, "Morgan Rot waits. The door remains open." 5 simple words that carried the weight of everything they hadn't been able to say. A week later, as they prepared for transfer to the East Coast Processing Center, Lieutenant Davis approached Walburga with an official-looking envelope. "This came for you, Miss Vogel, from the International Red Cross." Inside was confirmation that her parents had survived the war, though their village had been heavily damaged. They were living in a refugee camp, but were safe. The relief nearly buckled her knees. As she boarded the train that would take them east, Walburga carried 2 precious possessions: the small wooden horse that fit perfectly in her palm, and the beautifully crafted medicine box, now finished with her initials on the lid. Inside it, carefully wrapped, was a packet of seeds from the Diamondback Ranch garden and a photograph of the Dawson family standing in front of the ranch house, the German women beside them, not prisoners and captors, but people who had shared an extraordinary chapter amid the global cataclysm. The future remained uncertain. Germany lay in ruins, its people facing years of hardship and reconstruction. America was emerging as a world power, its relationship with former enemies yet to be defined by the politics of peace rather than war. But as the train pulled away from the station, carrying her toward whatever awaited in post-war Europe, Walburga held tightly to the small wooden horse, a tangible reminder of the most unexpected lesson of her captivity, that even in the midst of humanity's darkest hour, connection and compassion could flourish in the most unlikely places. And somewhere in Texas, a cowboy with a slight limp and hands skilled at carving beauty from rough wood tended a bay mare named Morganrod, keeping a door open to a future neither could yet imagine but both dared to hope for.